So welcome to this roundtable. My name is Abhishek Pari, although I'm appearing as Freya McMurrow in this particular session, which I think is quite symbolic given the nature of things in academia today. But I'm absolutely delighted and very honored to moderate this panel, which promises to be absolutely fascinating. We have three amazing panelists today. We have Professor Anne Rigney from University of Utrecht. We have Professor Jae-Yoon Lim from Sogang University, and we have Duan Zethro from University of Cape Town. And the whole point of this panel is to have a discussion, really, and we'll sort of keep it as fluid as we can, discussing the different methodological interventions in memory studies, how we sort of draw on different disciplines, including semiotics, discourse analysis, history, literacy, etc. And hopefully we'll sort of come to we'll produce a dialogic forum where we can discuss how memory studies as a discipline can be extended to different kinds of methodological innovations and interventions. So without any further ado, I welcome the panelists again, Professor Anne Rigney, Professor Jae-Yoon Lim, and Duan Zethro, and I officially start the discussion. We'll keep it fluid and interactive, and we're happy to take a few questions, perhaps in the end, depending on how we're doing in terms of time. So if I could invite Professor Anne Rigney first for her presentation and our discussion, and then we can follow it up with Professor Jae-Yoon Lim and Duan. So.
Okay, thank you very much, Abhishek. I took today's roundtable as also an invitation to think about possible new methods that might be native to memory studies itself. So rather than thinking about the existing methods, think about, well, what does memory studies need in terms of new methods? And with this in mind, I wanted to tell you about an experiment that I've been conducting in the last years as part of a collaborative project that I've been leading here in Utrecht. Let me see. So yes, so this is a project called Remembering Activism, the cultural memory of protest in Europe. And basically the question we ask is, how is protest remembered, and how does that memory return in new protest movements? And a key idea behind this is the idea of the memory activism nexus, the idea that the memory of activism, memory activism and memory in activism are all playing into each other. And within our project, what we're specifically interested in is cultural memory work. So that is to say, storytelling in language, images, music, and performance, and how that storytelling is creating a cultural memory of activism. And one of the features of our work is that we're also interested in looking at the long term. So rather than looking at just a single generation, we're actually looking right back to 1870 and even beyond. So what I want to talk about today is specifically the cultural memory of activism. How have memory protest movements been remembered? And that has been a very key part of our research. And so basically, what is it that we do normally? We do basically three things. We collect instances of cultural remembrance, right? Archival research, examples of texts, movies, images, and so on. And then we use techniques of close reading, which is fairly traditional within literary studies, to analyze particular instances of storytelling. And then we do something more, and that is to say, we try to identify continuities in the reproduction of narratives and artifacts. So not just looking at the production, but the reproduction. And this has been key to my own work in the field of memory studies for many moons now. So I'm trying to then see if we can develop special techniques to capture this dynamic of reproduction within cultural memory over a longer period of time. And this brings us beyond, I think, more traditional methods in literary studies. So to try and do that, what we did was to develop a relational database. And this is using the data management system called NodeGoat. And I say we, it's been very much a a teamwork, but specifically I've been working in collaboration with my colleague Stefan Poland, who helped me prepare this presentation today. And so basically, a database says it all. We're collecting instances. It's a place where we can just gather, make an archive of instances of storytelling about activism. But it's also a relational database, which means that we want to enter our data in such a way that we can establish the connections between the different elements, between texts and events and actors, and see if we can then see how they relate to each other. Now, I thought designing a database was going to be easy, but I can assure you it wasn't. And all of the React team can tell you that it's been created many headaches for us. And the first, of course, the biggest challenge was to define our core units. What do we collect when we collect these elements of cultural memory? So we had a lot of this led to a lot of theoretical discussion, very fundamental discussion about what is memory, because what are we trying to capture? Because a database forces you to make decisions about how you organize your data. And in the end, we decided to model our data around three basic types or objects: actors, events, and cultural carriers. And the cultural carriers is the center of our concerns. But basically, the idea is that every act of cultural remembrance involves somebody who produces a culture or reproduces a cultural carrier, which refers to the past. That can be an event, but it can also be an actor, but it can also be a cultural carrier. So you begin to see that we can establish different sorts of relationships between our objects, and all of which are always also encoded for time and place. And so we have these different sorts of relations, and this is just giving you some of them, ones which are based on recollection. So a cultural carrier remembers an actor or remembers an event, but also based on reuse, where a cultural carrier, a new cultural carrier reuses or remediates an older one, or where an event, for example, a protest event, reuses a cultural carrier, for example, by singing a song. So we have multiple sorts of relations that we want to set up. Now, I could go into a lot of technical detail. I will spare you that, and I realize this might be a little bit complicated if you're not familiar with database language, but the important thing is that you get a sense of that we're dealing with a dynamic network of relations between events, actors, and carriers. If you like, an actor network in Latour's sense. Now, one of the features of NodeGo, that's the data management system, is that it also allows us to visualize these relations. So not just to encode them into the database, but to visualize the relationship. So I want to give you just a few examples to see where this might take us. And the first example has to do with two very important texts about the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune is one of the very central foci of our research. The first one is Lisegaret's Histoire de la Commune, which was written in 1876, and the other one is one more familiar to most of you, which is Karl Marx's The Civil War in France, which was produced in 1871, so almost contemporaneous with the events. Lisegaret is an eyewitness testimony to the events. Now, we collected, using various library catalogs and other resources, we identified 250 versions of these different texts, including translations and new editions. And then what NodeCode allowed us to do, because each of these entries is coded for time and place, it allowed us to map the movement of these texts across the world. And I just want to show you what the result is. So what you're going to be seeing here is the ways the production and reproduction of these texts. The red one represents Marx, and the blue one is Lisegaret, and the timeline is bringing us from the 1870s right into the present. And as you'll see in the first phase, Marx and Lisegaret are very almost equally important. They're spread very much around Europe and into the Americas and over to Asia. But as we move into the 20th century, Marx becomes more dominant, particularly around the centenary of 1871, particularly in Eastern Europe. But after 1989, we see a fall off in interest in reproducing Marx, and we see instead, as it were, a return of Léger, a renewed interest in that text. So this gives us a tool of showing the afterlives and also the geographical spread of different texts. Now, the second example is a little bit more complicated, because what we try to do is not just to look at two different texts and how they've been reproduced, but to look at the different media as they have been used in order to remember the commune. And so we've color-coded all of these different types of media and looked for entries which were linked to the commune. And in doing so, we didn't use a geographical visualization, but a network visualization. And most network visualizations are used for social networks, right? The networks between people. What we were trying to do was to use network analysis to show the relationship between carriers and between themselves, and also the relationship between the carriers and the original event to which they referred. Excuse me. So here we see another visualization. This one, it's where the database is picking up the entries across time from the 1870s and is establishing the different ways in which different clusters as are forming of reproductions of certain narratives and artifacts. And as the time is passing, of course, you're going to see the emergence of of course, the thing in the center is the commune to which everything refers. But around that, what you're seeing is the Marx constellation. You're seeing the Léger constellation. You're also seeing a constellation around the figure of Louise Michel, who is one of the most important communard leaders, and who is sometimes remembered separately, but always as a particular focus, but also in relation to the commune. And as this comes to rest, as we get into the present day, what you're beginning to see here is these clusters, but if you look also closely, and that's what you can do in the live version of it, you can actually see what are the names. You begin to see different threads as different media forms are reproduced and form different traditions of representation. And one of the interesting things is how important music is. It's indicated here in yellow. Okay, so all of this makes for, I think you'll agree, quite interesting visual patterns. But of course, is it more interesting than this? Well, is it worth it to go to this sort of level of complexity just to create visual fireworks? So what might it mean for us? And I just want to raise 3 points which might be for fruitful points of discussion. So just a reflection, of course, with a database like this, the value will always depend on the quality of the data you put into it. And I will fully recognize at this point that this is an incomplete data set. We're still working on it. We've about 2,000 carriers in the database related to 200 protest events, but there's obviously much, much more. So this is a very limited set, but I hope nevertheless we can draw a number of conclusions, more general conclusions about the possible value of such an approach, which, as I suggest, may be particular to our area of concern, memory. The first point is to do with cultural memory studies. I think this sort of approach can also help us in upscaling our study from the study of single artifacts to bigger constellations. And in doing so can actually make visible different points of density, as it were, and of convergence within a very disparate and very invisible sort of field. So it helps make visible that field of culture and showing the different sort of trajectories within it. Secondly, I think it could be used in the future to develop more fully an actor network approach to memory, which would allow us not just to look at the relationship between carriers, but also the relationship between people and the relationship between people and carriers. And I just illustrate that with just one slide. as Stefan and I were working on the commune case, we realized that it looked as if Marx and Lézy-Garré were completely operating independently of each other, and we couldn't quite make sense of this until we decided to include the publishers into our visualization. And at that point, we realized that there was a strong connection between the two text through the publisher, Dietz, the German publisher, who not only was an important mediator between the French and the German sphere, but also clearly was helping to create a common public for both Lézy-Garré and for Marx. So I give this as an example that if you were to use for activate other aspects of the entries, you can begin to get a more integrated analysis both of actors and cultural carriers. And then just the final point, and perhaps maybe in the end the most important point, is that I found that trying to develop such a database was not just of methodological interest for the reasons I've just set out, but I also think it forces us and has forced us to think much more sharply about concepts, about the basic concepts of what is memory, what is remembrance, what is cultural memory. So in that way, this sort of methodological experiment can also be a tool for theoretical reflection. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating. I think I speak from everyone here when I say that this confluence, if you will, between different discourses, it's almost looking at the future of memory studies in a certain way. We're also drawing on the extant methodological framework. So I think there's a lot of, it certainly triggered lots of ideas in my head. I'm sure there'll be interesting questions towards the end as well. So thank you very much for that, Professor Rigney. I personally learned a lot from it, and I hope to have a longer conversation with you later as well. But we'll move on now to the next panelists here, and that's Professor Jae-Hyun Lim, who's a professor of transnational history and director of the Critical Global South Institute at Sogang University. So if you're ready, Professor, you can.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you very much. You know, while the Enriching's a presentation about the methodology, it's really hardcore methodology, but mine is rather very much a soft approach to methodology. So let's say it's a sort of a conceptual prism through which we understand, we perceive the memories more than proper methodology themselves. So I want to suggest two key concepts which can be relevant to our way of perceiving the memories, especially that was initiated by recent debates in Germany and Poland and East Asia. So I want to sum up a certain conceptual, a new awakening into two key concepts: critical relativization and radical juxtaposition. Yes, let me start with historical stride and relativization. As many of you know that there was a certain historical debates in Germany, West Germany in 1986 and 87. The legacy of historical stride in Germany in 1986 was that comparing the Holocaust to other genocides minimizes the German-initiated crime and undermines the seriousness of German claims to responsibility, especially Ernst Nolte's mechanical juxtaposition of the crimes of Nazism and Stalinism with its accent of Nazism as a response to Stalinism certainly made an effect of diminishing the enormity of the Holocaust, and especially his a new way of seeing the Second World, so-called European Civil War, Bolshevism versus Nazism, East versus West, and especially he tends to interpret Nazism as a response to Asiatic communist Bolshevism's aggression towards Western Europe. So in a sense, this historical strike, especially this Nolte's revisionist approach, made an effect that comparing Nazism with any other genocide minimizes, they say, a crimes of Nazism. So after that, the historical strike in 1980s the word relativization belonged to the index expurgatorius of German historiography and memory. So it is true, many people, many historians and memory studies scholars and humanities and social scientists really try to escape from relativization or suspicion of relativizing work since the historical strike in the 1980s. But we can see that in the year 2020, we can see the historical strike version 2.0 in global list, I would say. You know, the Jan Grabowski's very, very inspiring article to criticize Mars and Virushin's joint communique to commemorate 75th anniversary of the end of Second World War. And actually, it is a very good a small article that shows how the perspective of the globalist can do an input to our understanding of Second World War or Holocaust and any other things. And this Mars and the at the time German foreign minister and Virushin, so one of the most well-known contemporary historians in Germany, they made a joint communique that saying that anyone who disagrees with the German soul guilt does injustice to victims and make history instrumental. And from the viewpoint of the perspective of globalists from Poland, Eastern Europe, their communique is problematic because it ignores the Holocaust complicity among East Europeans under Nazi occupation. And then, so, I mean, no one can deny the determined goodwill of conscientious Germans to take the exclusive responsibility for the Nazi genocide, but it helps local collaborators to whitewash their perpetration. Yesterday's Lozhenitsha's talk, we could hear that a Ukrainian ambassador in Germany and his talk about the role of Ukrainians during the Holocaust. And then, in a sense, this Mars and Virushin's argument that for the sole responsibility of Germans for Holocaust, in a sense, helps some others, their neighbors, who are collaborating with Nazi Germans to whitewash their perpetration. So Germans' exclusively national responsibility for the Holocaust, in a sense, proves to be immoral in the transnational mnemonic nexus. So in this sense, the debates between Grabowski and then the Mars Virushin, not the debate, but Grabowski's sort of one-way criticism against Mars and Virushin's joint communique, in a sense, shows us a certain necessity of an escape from the negative symbiosis, which actually helps to establish certain national identity both in Germany and Israel. So I mean that we need also a sort of, according to, in terms of Grabowski, we need a globalization of German responsibility. Also, I would reinterpret his wording of globalization of German responsibility into deprovincializing the German cultural memory. I mean that, in a sense, German cultural memory needs to be a escape from the bilateral context of Germany and Israel, but with a more globalized context, we can see it. But also before then, in the year 2015, we have a very interesting debates about Holocaust and refugee question in Poland. Jan Gross just opened the fire in his the contribution to Die Welt 2015. The quote, East Europeans have revealed themselves to be intolerant, illiberal, xenophobic, and incapable of remembering the spirit of solidarity. But he just pointed out the Poles or Polish government's reluctance to accept the Islamic refugees after the Syria, the civil war. But by juxtaposing the anti-refugee intolerance in Poland and Eastern Europe in general, and apologetic Holocaust memories in the post-communist Poland and Eastern Europe, he tried to find a certain connectedness between their reluctance to accept Islamic refugees and their apologetic Holocaust memories. Against Jan Gross's a contribution, Zaremba and Smolla, two very, very eminent and very bright Polish historians, they immediately responded in Gazeta Wyborcza, and their counter-argument was that unlike Western European countries, Poland has never been a colonial power to rule over the native art of different cultures, religions, and races. So anti-colonial indictment on the West European colonialism is the implicit argument that you are guilty of colonialism, you Western Europeans, but we Eastern Europeans are innocent. So the refugee problem belongs to you. So, I mean, this is a little bit very disappointing, especially for me, because these two very eminent Polish historians could have had a different critical ideas about the past of the Eastern European, especially Polish past, against its neighbors, so-called Cressy and the like Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and the Belarusians, and I think that the Poland, in a sense, was a sort of subaltern empire to their weak neighbors and the more eastern neighbors. So, but in 1950, very to my surprise, there was a Polish translation of MSA's earliest version of discourse sur the colonialism. It means that also in this discourse, Amy Cesar already pointed out that certain connectedness between a Holocaust and the colonial genocide. So it's a quite the earliest, one of the earliest translation of Amy Cesar's work was done in Poland, but after that, that sort of approach, post-colonial approach to the Second World War was just forgotten in Poland. I don't know why. Perhaps it is one of the questions that should be answered. And also, East Asian perspective, we can see quite often. Remembering Hiroshima and Nagasaki quickly became a way of forgetting Nanjing, Bataan, comfort women, and countless other Japanese atrocities. And especially since Hiroshima became an icon of Japan's past as an innocent war victim and a beacon for its future as a pacifist nation. So sometimes this juxtaposition or a certain mechanical or very sophisticated, but sometimes it contributes to nationalizing the memories of those victims of any specific nation. And one can also find a very interesting example, the juxtaposition of Saint Maximilian Kolbe and Avon Catholic victims of Nagasaki, because Saint Maximilian Kolbe was a missionary in Nagasaki for 6 years from 1931 to 1936. And Maximilian Kolbe, even some article called Miracle Kiseki was published in the literature textbook in the Japanese high school. So Maximilian Kolbe is one of the really well-revered saints among the Japanese Catholics, but also just ordinary Japanese who sacrificed oneself to save the other inmates in Auschwitz. But in this juxtaposition of Saint Maximilian Kolbe and Avon Catholic victims of Nagasaki, there was totally no mention about the certain anti-Semitism debates about the Maximilian Kolbe's. I mean that there were certain debates about the anti-Semitism by Maximilian Kolbe in Poland already from 1971 when the Maximilian Kolbe was beatified, but just without any mentioning of this sort of debates, just Maximilian Kolbe has been really secularized in the collective memory of Avon Catholic victims in Nagasaki. So I mean, this is one of the good examples to show just juxtaposition could be a little bit harmful to the critical memories on the global space or globally. So how can we develop a critical juxtaposition in the place of just apologetic juxtaposition by stressing one's own a certain national memory by juxtaposing the other nations' memories and something like that. So still, I think that a critical relativization and then this sort of a radical juxtaposition needs to be investigated further. And also in the year 2020, we have also, we could witness a very sharp debate in Germany, especially since Lorenz Deutsch accused Achille Mbembe as an anti-Semitic Israel critic, Holocaust relativization and extremist disinformation. And then it's actually visibly, apparently, he pointed out Mbembe's essay, The Society Enmity, in which Mbembe juxtaposed the apartheid in South Africa and the destruction of Jews in Europe as two emblematic manifestations of a fantasy of separation. And then what is interesting in this debate in 22, from my viewpoint, a paradigm shift from the national history of the historical strike in 1986 to the transnational history of historical strike, a version, a second version in the post-Cold War era. You know, by witnessing through these interesting debates in Poland, Germany, and Japan, so I could reach a certain idea or wording of critical relativization and the radical juxtaposition as a way of understanding a mnemonic, a nexus of post-colonial and Holocaust. So the conceptual tool of criticizing both relativist dismissal of the German responsibility and simple negation of comparability of the Holocaust, I really want to elaborate these two key concepts. And then also one of the interesting things is that in the current debates of the Council of Mbembe in Germany, it is conservative wing who stands for the singularity of the Holocaust and against the post-colonial view of the Holocaust in the context of global colonialism. Means that in mid-1980s, it was a rather very conservative right-wing revisionist who stressed for the relativization, but the different conservative wing nowadays stands for the singularity of the Holocaust while denying comparability. So critical relativization is in tune with the multidirectional memories of colonialism, Holocaust, and Stalinist crimes in the global memory space, I would say. And also, radical juxtaposition is a montage of different memories with the spontaneous commonalities for a non-hierarchical comparison of human tragedies. So I'm still thinking of this critical relativization and radical juxtaposition as two conceptual keywords through which we may approach to today's mnemoscape of the global memory regime. So that's all what I want to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lim. I think it was really interesting, and it touches upon some very key elements in memory studies, including, but not limited to, forgetting, the phenomenon of forgetting, and of course, relativization and the problematic construction of relativization. So I think that was really interesting, and I'd be very interested to see how you and Professor Rigney can have a dialogue in terms of how the different methodologies you appropriate can have a conversation later. So we move on now to the third panelist in this session, Duan Zethro, who is a junior research fellow at the Center for Curating the Archive based in the Michaelis School of Fine Art at the University of Cape Town. So if you're ready, we look forward to your session.
Thank you, Abhishek, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. I think my case study is going to be on a smaller scale and hyper-local and not as transnational and a grander scale as the previous two presentations. I'll share the page for the exhibition that I co-curated with the Michaelis Galleries curator Jade Nair, as well as with our curatorial assistant Sophie Cope. In April 2021, on the 18th of April 2021, a devastating fire struck the University of Cape Town and ignited the archives and building of UCT libraries, specifically the Jagger Library, which is home to some of the most important print collections in African studies for our university and for South Africa as well. In the basement of the Jagger Library building itself were held the archival deposits of our rare books, archival deposits, as well as rare book collections and photographic collections as well. So inside this this building was contained really important African studies collections in the reading room, but also valuable archival resources in the basement. The building itself was burned, the reading room itself was burned, but the materials that were held in the archive below, some of which was damaged and some of which was fortunately saved. No one died in the disaster, but there was absolute devastation of the archive as well as of the building. It was in the aftermath of the devastation of the library and the loss of these archives that the UCT libraries implemented a salvage and recovery operation where they opened up a program for volunteers and members of the public to assist them with the removal of the materials that were on the site of the Jagger Library, as well as in the basement stores. This was called the salvage operation. And for a period of weeks, members of the public and the UCT community, including staff and students, were involved in the physical labor of removing this material from the basement stores, moving it through emergency conservation, or immediately transporting it off-site for re-archiving. This period of salvage was really significant, partly because it was the first time that members of the public were able to get such intimate access to archival and knowledge resources that were kept under the custody of UCT libraries. The entire program was managed by the UCT Library Administration, but it was a communal process of the salvage and recovery of these archival remains. Nevertheless, in the wake of the salvage operation, my colleague Jade Nair and I got into a discussion about ways of engaging with what the salvage operation actually was, and how it resonated with this community of volunteers who participated in the salvage operation. We noticed that on social media and other platforms, it was really resonant. It resonated strongly with members of the public and those who had participated in the process of contributing towards the salvage. So people were taking photographs and posting it on the social media, for example, and sharing their reflections and memories of the salvage, but also the sense of grief at the loss of the library as well. And it was seeing these images and having had an experience of the salvage in the case of my colleague Jade Nair, that we came up with the idea of having and hosting an exhibition that paid homage to the organized process of salvaging the archive, but also the communal work of actually doing that, but also memorializing the loss of this building and the materials there. Just to fast forward, our exhibition opened on the 1-year anniversary of the loss of the library, and the exhibition was a collaboration between the Center for Curating the Archive, where I work, the Michaelis Galleries, which is at the University of Cape Town's upper campus, as well as with UCT libraries. The basic terms of the exhibition was that it would memorialize the loss of the library as well as the archives, but also commemorate the work of UCT libraries as well as the many volunteers that were involved in the process of the salvage of the archive. So we have these two terms in tension here. On the one hand, we have the memorialization of the loss of the archive, but also the commemoration of the work of actually salvaging the materials. The exhibition, of course, was driven by a curatorial approach and a curatorial perspective. So what does it mean to use the images that were generated not only by UCT libraries, but also by volunteers, so official but also unofficial images for reflecting on what the salvage was all about, but also to use matter from the site, burnt matter that had been preserved for the purposes of future preservation and future reflection on this institutional disaster. Based at the Michaelis School of Fine Art, we also approached graduate students who had been thinking about and thinking with the Jagger Library fire, using their artworks, but also commissioning a few artworks related to and engaging with the disaster. So I'll cycle through just a few pictures of what the exhibition actually looked like, and then I'll turn to the memory aspect of our exhibition as well. So just to give you an impression of what our exhibition looked like, we drew on excuse me. We drew on many of the images that UCT Library itself had developed, as well as images and documentation from their own website. So I wonder, can you see this image?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So this is the exterior of the exhibition space, where you can see the landscape around the University of Cape Town and the fire coming down from the mountain that ultimately consumed our library. Moving inside the exhibition space, you can see that we've used physical objects from the Jagger Library itself. On the wall, you can see a grate that was from the building, as well as crates in the foreground here that were used for the transportation of the burnt matter and archival material from the site. In the distant background, you can see an image of some of the volunteer work. It's a little bit blurry, but the image is coming up. You can see the labor-intensive process of transporting the materials out of the basement store and into the archival spaces on the University Avenue. Unfortunately, this image is taking a while to load. I won't cycle through the entire exhibition, but just to give you an impression of some of the elements that were included in the exhibition. This was what the library looked like on the day after the blaze had been extinguished. And here you can see a shelf of burnt books, as well as a fire extinguisher that was salvaged from the site itself. I think I'll go through one or two more images for you to see, just to give you an impression of how we constituted these different kinds of materials, including artworks from students, debris and matter that was salvaged from the UCT Library site. In the center of the exhibition space, we constructed a debris sculpture. This was a sculpture using actual crates that were used to salvage material from the UCT Library site, as well as various types of debris that were salvaged from and preserved by UCT libraries themselves. In the bottom left-hand corner of the debris sculpture, you can see a roof tile, because it was the roof that ultimately caught fire and collapsed in onto the archive. So in some ways, the debris sculpture that we had built was a representation of an imploded archive. So now I want to move to the use of volunteer memories. So it was really important for Jade and myself to honor the memories of volunteers who had participated in the salvage operations. We wanted to place this strong emphasis on this. And we issued a call via the University of Cape Town Library's volunteer database. So everyone who signed up for participating in the volunteer process, their information was kept on a special database. And it was through our partnership with UCT Libraries that we were able to appeal to volunteers, for reflections that resonated with them about the salvage. So we asked them questions like, what did the salvage mean to you? What stuck with you? from that time, what do you remember most fondly? And we issued an infographic with the QR code, and the QR code directed back to the UCT Libraries digital collection. So the Ibali platform, you can see our exhibition website is mounted on the Ibali digital collections platform. So volunteers were able to submit images, voice notes, texts, and all kinds of reflections via the Ibali website. And they were able to provide the credits for all the images and all the information and data points that they wanted to contribute. So in effect, the memories of the salvage were now also being used to develop an archive of memory as such of the salvage operation. We used the over 30 responses that we received from the various volunteers to we reconstituted these memories into an open-ended scrapbook style book of memory. The title of our book is What Remains, Volunteer Memories of the Jaguar Library Salvage Operation. And just to give you a little bit of perspective of what the book looks like, the book is constituted entirely of images and texts that were contributed by the volunteers. So it's not an official portrait in any way. It's a portrait of these diverse kinds of reflections that were provided by various volunteers. So there were poems, images, short text, and the contributions came from people from all kinds of walks of life. So from young people to older people, former retired librarians, members of the public. And there were a number of themes that percolated in the kinds of reflections that came forward, both personal. So some people said that, well, they wanted to participate in the salvage process because of some kind of previous personal trauma that they'd undergone. And so working through the remains of salvaging the UCT library was a way of working through grief that they had experienced in the they'd experienced in the past. Contributing towards institutional memory was another theme. So it was really interesting, the kinds of reflections and themes that came up in these reflections that volunteers had contributed. So the use of memory in this project was really interesting insofar as it tied into the use of digital methods, so developing a digital archive of the memories of the salvage process. So it offers a kind of perspective on archival work as communal work also, and as an archive that's not necessarily something that is constituted by and exclusively by librarians and experts, but also something that is worked upon by ordinary members of the public. I think the Book of Memory stands as a reflection on ties between memory and affect and feeling, as a space for the processing of feelings, particularly a sense of feeling that I refer to as archival grief, a strange sense of loss that befell the wider intellectual community at the loss of this archive. What was also really fascinating was that the Book of Memory affirms the visual as a motif in this disaster, as a very particular anchor of memory. And then I think as perhaps two broader contributions to methodologies in memory studies, I think the first is that the Book of Memory and our use of memory of this disaster relates to the notion of archive and the ways in which these memories help to unsettle the locus of the archive. So while we may assume that the archive was situated in a building or is housed in a particular text, the Book of Memory relocates the archive as that which is held in the space of memory. And then ultimately as not only a complement, but also a kind of juxtaposition with the archive, these memories in some ways disturb the notion of archive that is in operation in this very particular site. So I hope that you all visit our website and that you get to access our Book of Memory. I'll share the link to the website so that you can find out more about the exhibition and the ongoing salvage operations, or at least the ongoing salvage operations that our university is embarked upon. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Duran. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure all of us would love to learn more about the website and the project that you are engaged with at the moment. And what was really interesting is how you're looking at the whole politics and the experience of Reconstruction and how Reconstruction operates as not just a material apparatus, but also an affective apparatus. And I think that that entanglement, if you will, between the affective, the material, and the discursive is what makes your project so fascinating. So I think this has been absolutely a stellar session, if I may say so. And what we could do now is perhaps open a conversation among the panelists. So if Anne, Siren, and Duran, we want to have a conversation about each other's methodologies, if you ask each other questions in a way that might be interesting for your own individual projects, we could do that. And then we can open it up for questions from the audience. So yeah, please feel free, the panelists, to start a conversation or each ask each other questions. If you're interested, no, yeah, please go ahead.
May I thank you very much. Thanks, Ji-hoon and Duan, for these really interesting talks. And obviously we have here also the challenge how to bring them together, because we come from different disciplines and perspectives. But listening to them, I guess I have a question question for each of you. And what struck me in thinking about how our talks compared, Ji-hoon, it struck me the question of scale comes out, right? The sort of at what scale do we operate? And one of the things that we've been trying to do is to work from this sort of the scale of the close reading of a single text to an understanding of bigger phenomena. And so also looking at scales of time, right? The sort of short-term effects, the long-term effects. Now, what you were raising was a question of comparison. And there's also a question of the comparison at which scale, right? And you have the question of the transnational and the national. And I was just wondering, in terms of what your thoughts are on this question of what is being compared with what, right? That was our basic challenge with the database. You know, what is your basic unit? So if you raising these issues of juxtaposition or of critical comparison, what are your thoughts on how do you define the scale at which that takes place, right? Well, what is your basic unit of comparison? And do you see possibilities for perhaps, instead of thinking in terms of national and the transnational, there might be other scales at which a comparison could be more productive, perhaps, done at the national level? So that was my question for Ji-hoon. Should I go ahead with my question for Duan as well? Yeah?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Again, what's great about having two things coming from very different perspectives, we look for the comparison, the point of where they meet, and this, in this case, is the digital. And what struck me about your very, very interesting project, and very sad, of course, the background to it, the loss of an archive, is this that you're not so much involved in studying memory, but in creating memory through this, by creating an archive, by creating a memory, by inviting people to produce memories. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on your role as a researcher in as it were, creating this memory. But then also the question is, to what extent does it really become a memory? I mean, if we follow my way of thinking in cultural memory is there in the repetition. So it's not in the formation of the archive or in the collecting of the stories, but in their reproduction. So one of the things I was very curious to hear about was this book. What has been the uptake? You got people to produce it, but did people start reading it? Has it been reproduced? Has it been, have people read it? Has it been circulating? So does it actually enter into cultural memory, or is it more like an archive piece, a collection, which will be now in the library? So I'd love your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Shall I respond?
Yeah, if you, yeah,
Okay.
sure. Good, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And this scale always matters in comparison, and then it's even the critical relativization. But I cannot say mathematically exactly what kind of scale can be really allow the comparison in proper terms. But I would say immediately when I talked of this critical relativization, three categories just pop up. First one, yes, of course, Holocaust. This Holocaust has been always a parameter through which one can gauge this tragedy and this genocide and something like that. But also, on the other hand, the colonial genocide in Africa, for example, Congo, and also, certain Indonesia under the Japanese the occupation, about 3 million people starved to death. In Vietnam, also between 1 million, 2 million, and of course, Stalinist, genocide, political genocide. So political genocide, the Holocaust and colonial genocide, I think that from the viewpoint of very rough mathematically gauged scales, I think these three at least can be compared rather properly not out of context. But on the other hand, also, I'm thinking of a qualitative scale. So every nation thinks that our tragedy is really real tragedy. Only our tragedy can be comparable to Holocaust. In that sense, people's way of perceiving a comparability of scales also different from our certain, how can I say, certain neutral understanding of these scales. So scales are quantitative and or objective, but also subjective scales of comparability always matters. So if we get into details of this critical relativization, we have lots of differences, ramifications regarding the critical relativization, but perhaps I may come back to this issue again in terms. But also I have a question to Anne or a certain suggestion. Actually in your map, Korea was omitted, but when I was a graduate student in 1986, I translated their Virgo Creek in Frankreich into Korean illegally, but under the pseudonym. So it's not under my name, but because it was at the time, we were under the anti-communist military dictatorship, so it was quite risky to translate and publish the Marx books. So just when I was a graduate student still on the streets, so I and my colleagues translated this illegally, their Virgo Creek in Frankreich into Korean in 1986. But the real thing that I want to suggest is that sometimes for example, in Korea, we had the Gwangju massacre in 1980. So during the Gwangju massacre, Gwangju citizens for about 8 days, 9 days, they just freed Gwangju city from the military rule, and the temporarily military, drove back. And then there was a certain autonomy, like a Paris Commune in Gwangju in 1980. So quite often humanities scholars and social scientists in Korea always kept in their mind Paris Commune as a sort of, a reference through which one can understand Gwangju and explain Gwangju. Even one political scientist described Gwangju as an absolute community. So I don't still understand, but it's a sort of mythologizing Gwangju massacre, but always quite often a later Marxist the interpretation of Paris Commune. You can find such a resonance in the Korean interpretation of this civil uprising against power. Perhaps in other regions, one can find the resonance of Paris Commune in understanding their own civil uprisings or popular uprisings. You may extend this map into including these other regions, non-European, a way of perceiving or making use of Paris Commune as a leverage to explain their own historical past. That's my suggestion. Okay, thank you.
I think I'll respond to that after Duan has a chance, but thank you very much, Jihoon.
Duan, you want to respond?
Thank you for the wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful questions, Anne, yeah, that's exactly right. In some ways, the exhibition project was an exercise in the production of memory. So I'm a scholar that focuses on the cultural construction of heritage and contested public cultures. So oftentimes I'm doing analysis of the kind of commemorative and memorial work that is employed around events exactly like this. And oftentimes observing this as a researcher, you notice what are perceived as sometimes spontaneous responses, both commemorative and memorial responses that are applied or that arise around these events, around disasters. So for example, marking the site of disaster with all kinds of material effects, whether it's laying of flowers or removing matter from that site, but marking the site out in very particular ways. And then also recalling that site in all kinds of ways, whether it's on social media or in practical terms. So it was it was quite jarring, but also triggering for me to have a disaster strike my place of work. So this is an archive that I would use. This is my home institution, and so the disaster enabled me to turn to the conceptual resources that I was quite familiar with, to turn to them and to make a contribution, especially through the lens of the curatorial. So what does the curatorial enable me in collaboration with my colleagues to do in order to inscribe this in a dignified way in our institutional memory and in our institutional history? How can I draw on my scholarly background? And so there was that benefit of having scholarly knowledge and experience of having worked on these phenomena. But of course, now I have to step back a little bit and do some critical self-reflection on my own role as a researcher in the process of initiating some of the terms in which this event is actually recalled, right? So the exhibition is a staging ground, one staging ground for the way in which this event is recalled. There are other modalities, press releases and all kinds of other reflections that will come out, but the exhibition is one way of engaging with that. So thanks for that, for turning my attention back to my own role as a researcher in this. And then I like the provocation around when are these observations memories? Are they memories simply because they are iterations, or are they memories because they are iterations that are put into circulation? And what has the response been like to the book? So we haven't had an official book launch yet. Everything moved really quickly, although the exhibition has been included in May already. The book is available. It's freely available on the website for everyone to access. So it's not a book that is a physical text that is kept in the library. We thought it was very important for us to honor the openness and communal spirit of the salvage through this open access process, and to be as gentle and as light with the text as possible, the different memories. So I can't contribute on how it's been taken up just yet. I don't have any official figures on how it's been received just yet. But I will think with that. I will think with this idea of uptake and circulation going forward, and to carry on with the relay of questions. I was curious, and with your project, I think because in our project, we also used this digital infrastructure for the capturing of memory, right? And I think there's a kind of philosophy, or at least a kind of phenomenology of the conversion of what is a memory and what is a data point. And if you could just talk to how you negotiated that in your team as to that philosophy and the phenomenology of what is a memory, what is a data point, how is that reflected, how is that ultimately captured? Thank you.
So we got a couple of questions and then one written in the chat box as well. So do you want to respond to Jiyoon's question first?
Thanks you both very much, and I'm just really struck by your story, Jiyoon, of your own translation, your own sort of guerrilla translation. So please, I'm looking forward to adding that to the database too, and indeed. Mark's text is such an amazingly world text that it really offers itself to the possibility of adding in much more perspectives from other languages. So that's something that I would love to do when we're moving forward. In terms of the sort of the references again to the commune and later events, that's something that I'm also looking into very much. That doesn't lend itself to quite as easily to to capture in a database, and this is perhaps also already a step up towards Dwayne's question. We started by trying to see if we could capture in the database also references to earlier events in protest movements. And as you know, the commune is invoked on many occasions, such as in the Occupy movement, and now I'm hearing also in Gwangju in 1980. So, but it's often in the form of single references, or in our very short use of slogans, or more generally in a lexicon that's used. That has proved to be much more difficult to capture in the form of a database. So that means that we've been looking more at how discrete sort of cultural artifacts are being produced as part of this dynamic sort of assemblage. So this maybe helps to sort of come to Dwayne's question: how do you establish what you put in a database? As I said, we had huge discussions, and we've had so many designs and redesigns of the database because we weren't learning what you can define as data. And in a way, a reference to the commune on the streets of Gwangju in 1980, we could not translate into, even if we were aware of it, which we weren't, we could not translate that into a database because it was too granular, right? And it was too undefined, because a reference to the commune can be the telling of the whole story of the commune, or it could just be the name, or it can be an indirect use of a song. So that was much more difficult to capture. So we had to end up using the carriers as being our unit of the main object we could put in, and actors meaning individuals, but also collectives. And there we had already a big discussion, right? This is what I mean by you have these discussions. What is an actor? Is it, for example, if you're talking about you have an individual, that's clear, birth date, death, date, place of birth. But what about a movement, right? You have organizations, they often have a birth date, an organization. But a movement like Occupy movement, it doesn't, it's an actor, but it's not an actor in the same way that can be defined and described as an actor like Louise Michel or Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who are definable entities. And so it's in that level of having to sort of try to translate something into the constraints of a system that you, on the one hand, you think, well, you're being very reductive because you're reducing complexity, right? At the same time, you are forced to really think through, for example, the notion of agency, if it comes to the question of who produces a text, right? So we have Marx producing the Civil War in France. When Engels puts on his preface to it, actually that's the text that becomes much more the one that's really reproduced intensely. So then Engels is already in on this as being a co-producer. But then we've got the publisher and the translator, and then before you know it, the sort of mnemonic actors have become much more diverse, which makes your template much more difficult to deal with. At the same time, you've already had to encounter a whole set of issues about who does what and where does the agency lie in the transfer of one story to another, right? Because from a literary studies perspective, and I have argued this in the past too, that the texts themselves have a certain power. They have the power to regenerate themselves because they appeal to people. That's correct. That power is there, but it's not enough. You need these other actors and these other forces before something starts turning up, say, in the streets in Korea, right? There's a lot that's going on. And it's in that struggle through the limits, trying to understand what you can do with such a data management program and what you want to do with it, that you have to really force. I found that it's been really good in thinking through a lot of issues and creating much more complexity in my thinking about these things. I don't know if that's quite an answer to your question, but that I hope gives us a little sense of the sort of, that it's not been just a blind application of something. On the contrary, it is a creative process too in creating what is a data, what is your unit of analysis.
Well, that's wonderful. So there's a question for Anna, the chat box, if you can read it.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. I have seen it. Thank you, Federico. And this is a question about the particular conditions of which cultural memory is produced, say, in Latin America, when you have the cultural memory of peoples who are forcibly removed, which is being then having an influence from the colonizer. I presume that you have different groups and different forces at play in producing a cultural memory. I guess my answer there, Federico, would be that I wouldn't talk about a cultural memory, because that suggests something which is a single thing. I tend to think of cultural memory as a dynamic, as a process, which is multi-sited and multimedial, and it's full of negotiations as well as convergences around certain narratives and certain artifacts. So I guess the answer there was, is it possible to think of a cultural memory from the fusion of these three categories, or is memory built on the difference between them? I think this is a question of a case-to-case, would have to be looked at on a case-to-case basis. As I would see it, you have competing narratives, competing stories which are circulating, and some of them never reach each other. They can circulate in different groups, and that becomes then determines the cultural memory of that particular group. What becomes then interesting within the framework, particularly of nation states, is that you begin to get a sense of how do these different stories talk to each other? Can they talk to each other? And before they start talking to each other, of course, there has to be some point of a platform for the meeting, the bringing together of these stories. And sometimes these are institutions, sometimes the museum institutions, where at the moment in the Netherlands, museums are playing an extremely important role in, for example, now putting on the agenda in a very public manner the question of the history of slavery, whereby it comes from, moves from being a minority memory, which was very, very important to the Surinamese community within the Netherlands, and now it's becoming more mainstream by virtue also of the work of these institutions. So I think it's a dynamic, and it depends on, a sense, who is in a position of power, who has access to these means, but also who is willing to listen, and in what sort of a conversation has emerged. But that certain things, that certain the merging of different traditions is possible. I think history has shown that is the case. We constantly have these consolidation of narratives, and then again the contestation. So I think this is an ongoing process. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. So there's a question for actually everyone on the panel from Meng Jung Lee. So about remembering and recording and archiving some historical events in the world of networks, and essentially about the ontology of the media today in terms of how media operates as an apparatus around memory. So yeah, just feel free to respond to that. And there's a question from Nainika Mukherjee specifically to Professor Lim. So do you want to take that first and then maybe go back to the more generic question? If that's okay.
Yeah, I think I can respond to a Mukherjee's question or comment. Yeah, I like your term of genocide, cosmopolitanism. This is also very interesting. Yes, I mean that I would say a certain way of making mnemonic solidarity among the victims of different genocides, right? I mean that because in the actual genocide, what happened in the past, those victims were not really connected or entangled, but in their memories, they can be entangled in remembering their genocides very often by referencing or through cross-references of different genocides. So I guess your term of genocide cosmopolitanism may refer that cross-referencing different genocides by through the two in order to understand even their own tragedies or genocides by through the references of different genocides. So I would say mnemonic solidarity among the victims of different genocides can be categorized under the umbrella of genocidal cosmopolitanism. But yes, critical relativization, I think, might be one starting point to reach that sort of mnemonic solidarity or genocidal cosmopolitanism, you know, through the suffering or pains of differently other people, other victims of genocide in the remote place in the globe, one can really understand one's own pains and sufferings, and through which one can really get a sort of a mnemonic solidarity, or in terms of Michael Rosberg, mnemonic, multidirectional memories. Through the working multidirectional memories, we can really also understand the others, even oneself. So I think this multidirectional memory or genocidal, a cosmopolitanism or mnemonic solidarity, or this critical relativization or radical juxtaposition, all these, I think that in a sense, very roughly can be put under one umbrella, I think. I'm not sure if this is enough answer to your question.
Cornelia's got a hand up, so if you want to comment.
Yeah, no, thank you, Professor Lim. I just also wondered, what are the pitfalls of these frameworks? How do you struggle as well theoretically when you are writing about it? Because when you're writing about it, you also think of the different ways these concepts can be read. And it would be interesting to see the struggles, methodological struggles as well we have when figuring these frameworks out. Thank you.
If I just add one comment, I mean, the arguably, you know, this globalization in the 21st century is a globalization of memory. So one can see the emergence of global memory space or global memory formation. But global memory formation does not necessarily guarantee deterritorialization of memory. Sometimes it enforces competition for the national competition for the victim. So there has been always a tension between deterritorialization and reterritorialization of memories in the global memory formation. So I think I understand your term of genocidal cosmopolitanism or multidirectional memories or critical relativization, all etc. are really, we try to, how can I say, certain shape global memory formation into the direction of deterritorialization of memories. So in a sense, we are on the same track with the same efforts and same intention. Thank you.
Wonderful. I think it's an acknowledgement of the methodological fault lines, which can sometimes be interesting, that might actually enrich the entire ontology of the method, as it were, the recognition of the fault lines between different interpretative lens. So if you could just go back to the more generic question by Mingkyung Lee. It's just a question addressed to the panel. I would like to, so.
Maybe if I could just come in here very briefly, I think there's a question about how to remember and record or archive historical events in the contemporary media landscape. It seems to me this is a very important, obviously very, very important question, one which I think is specifically of importance to historians, because the sense of the quality of information is a question which is central to the historian's concerns and also to the archivist concerns, right? And so what are you archiving? Where does it come from and what does it mean? From a memory perspective, I think it's a question which is less perhaps relevant in the sense that from a memory perspective, the memory of memory actors, where an information comes from is not really as important as what does it mean, right? What can one do with it? So I think behind this question, there's a lot of possible different perspectives about how we deal with information, and indeed how does the archive as such play in a role within memory studies. And Dwayne's example was extremely interesting from that perspective. The sort of the shifting role now of the archive as itself a mnemonic production rather than just a resource for historians. And I think this question, I think, reminds us of the fact that there are different ways of looking at an archive, and that it would be something that we could take on board as we move forward in this discussion.
Thanks, on Minkyung Lee's question. I think that I read Minkyung Lee's question in two ways. In the first way I read it, it's about the contemporary. So in our case, we seize the means and modes of memory production, so to say, using the methods of mediation that are available to us. So the ways in which people took photographs on their mobile phones, they were able to generate messages, for example. So all of the very familiar ways that people go about in the everyday business generating memories, we seize these modes to generate this archive. So there's an agency in the exhibition and the gathering of these memories that we were trying to seize upon, rather than having to work with a mediated narratives about the event as they were circulated in newspapers, etc. So that's the one sense of mediation in which I see your question. The other sense of mediation I see your question is, and this was something that sat in the background of our exhibition and something that we didn't have an opportunity to explore, was how the archive that we were working with itself, the information there was mediated by the historical conditions under which it was formulated. So our archive was at a university that undergoing a process of transformation, especially vigorously in the last 7 years since the Rose Must Fall movement, which has called attention to the colonial legacies, both material but also symbolic and epistemic, that our university is couched in and is constructed out of. And the Jagger Library is an important locus of these colonial legacies. And the repository that's kept there is also something that was mediated by these historical legacies. And so when we talk about the mediation of information, I also see it in that sense. How do we sit with an archive that is mediated and is infused with these colonial legacies also? It's something that sat with me and sat with my colleagues also in thinking about the exhibition. And then just to jump on Tanim Mozumder's question also about the curation of a space, of a physical collective space that can also lead to a certain kind of healing. I'm hesitant to say that the exhibition was a space of healing. I think it provided an opportunity for certain forms of closure to occur, and certain forms of closure to occur for certain constituencies. I'm not sure about, as a scholar who lived and worked in a post-apartheid context where the idea of reconciliation, nation building, and healing is approached with a sense of trepidation. I'm cautious of using the word healing too easily, because it smooths over social tensions too easily. But I would say that our exhibition was very much a space of affective encounter, definitely with sadness and grief, where the burnt matter was very evocative, not only for librarians, but for members of the public who weren't, who had to encounter this disaster matter, and had to sit with that. And this was reflected in some of the messages that were left on the grate after they left the exhibition. So I'm not if encounter with grief leads to a sense of healing, but it definitely did create a space for some forms of closure. I'm also hesitant to think about the relationship between healing and archive together, especially because healing presents a sense of closure that doesn't allow us to interrogate the archive in all of its manifest complexities. Healing suggests a mono perspective and a sense of closure that cedes too much authority to the archive, I think. And so I'd be hesitant to use the word healing, but I would be open to using the word closure and partial closure. Thanks.
Right. I suppose the metonymic modality of memory and the metonymic materiality of memory, which constitutes the archive, it makes the sort of the grand narrative of healing a very problematic process. So yeah, so there's a self-reflexivity even inside the archive, which is quite metonymic in quality and non-hierarchical as well, I suppose, for the way you're looking at it. So there are a couple more questions. I'm just sort of wondering how we're doing in terms of time. So are we happy to take a couple more questions, or shall we just... there is a question by Archana Ravi, again, addressed to the entire panel, specifically Professor Lim, actually. So, Jayun, are you happy to answer that?
Yes, I will try, but I'm not sure if I can really answer to this question. Yes, sometimes these popular novels, the writings tends to romanticize and exoticize trauma, but also very often they try to highly nationalize trauma. So actually, no, each individual victims was a sufferer from trauma, but very often in the domain of cultural memory, these individual victims is very easily changed into national victimhood. So I would say instead of romanticizing or exoticizing trauma, nationalizing trauma can be found more frequently and most often in the popular writings. In the Lithuanian case, I don't know exactly, but I would say if one can apply the critical relativization to the Lithuanian context of Second World War, I would say there are certain two different arguments about the pains and sufferings from the Nazi occupation and from the Stalinist occupation, whose suffering is much bigger, and which one is more terrible. And very often in the post-Cold War era, East European societies and countries actually have been suffering from that division of this victimhood, Stalinist victimhood or Nazi victimhood or Holocaust victims. Also, this is very much multi-ethnicity is involved in this sort of thing. So I would say in through the critical relativization, if one try to understand the Lithuanian case, I would say this the historical experience of being victimized by two different so-called totalitarian regimes, and also depending on which ethnicity suffered from this or from that. This sort of complexity can be also helpful to understanding that the critical juxtaposition or radically juxtaposing these different the experiences may lead us to a certain more balanced understanding of what happened in our past and our memories.
Great. Meher has got a hand up for a while. Good to see you, Meher. Do you want to go ahead and ask a question? Yeah, great.
So good evening. Thank you to the panelists. This was a wonderful session. I have two questions. I have one for Professor Anne Rigney. Ma'am, you were mentioning, when you were talking about database and archival, you mentioned 3 object types, right? Actors, cultural carriers, and events. So I just want to know, are these structures that guide the process of archival and creating and designing the database? And also, if so, that if we consider the event, the devastating incident of the Jagger library, and if we were to create a database of such library devastations, and I mean, I learned more about juxtapositions from Professor Lim, but I couldn't help myself but remember the devastation, the plundering of the Ashurbanipal's library during the Assyrian Empire, and connecting the dots with what happened at Jagger. But could we identify the actors, cultural carriers, and event in the incident that happened at the Jagger library? If I was clear enough.
Yes, thank you, Mary. You were very clear, but you also asked a very difficult question, so I have to think about that one. In terms of what we're trying to do is, if you like, you have clouds in the sky, right? They're passing over the clouds, and you have to capture them in some way, so you have to have some sort of receptacle in which you can capture them. And that's how we ended up with what we call these objects. These objects, in database terms, it doesn't mean literally always a physical object, but rather an entity which we use to make an entry on. And so the carriers, the events, and the actors at times and places seem to us the basic unit of which you can talk about acts of memory, right? So if to the extent that I think we're talking about different sort of phenomenon when we're talking about Duane's case. I think when you're talking about the book, right? The book is is a cultural carrier, and the archive is a cultural carrier. So in that sense, yes, we could model it within our database, both at the level of the text and the level of the exhibition and the level of the whole archive. And again, this again leads to some sort of discussion. At what level do you want to sort of define it as an object? In some cases, it's very relevant to show that something is a part of something bigger. So you have a book which goes together with an exhibition, goes together with this whole digital archive. So you could identify all of those as cultural carriers and then connect them to the people who made them, and to the event of the destruction of the archive. So there you have the beginnings of how you could enter that into your database. It'd be a very small database unless it was part of a bigger project, but it could be, because to a certain extent, and that's what's interesting, all of these things are interconnected, right? Like the sky and all the clouds, at a certain point they do reach over to the other end of the earth. And so what you don't know when you start with a database is where the things are going to start connecting to each other. But clearly you have to have a little bit of a sense of what is the scope that you want to deal with. And our scope has been particularly Europe rather than South Africa. So that would not be a very likely starting point. But I hope that sort of answers your question of what you're trying to do when you're modeling such a modeling the phenomenon so that you can actually categorize it and then start showing the relations between them. And in a way that's sort of thinking about a series of events, like events of the burning of an archive. We have in Ireland a very major event, comparable event, which was the burning of the Public Records Office in 1922 during the Civil War, which was one of this devastation of a whole national heritage, which has now come back into the news since 100 years. But in a way, then by having two similar types of events and categorized perhaps as such, you might begin to start establishing links and find links between those two events. But offhand, I'm inventing them now. They would be probably unlikely in the debate.
Thank you, ma'am. And I also have a question for Professor Lim. Dr. Abhishek, can I go ahead?
Yeah, please go ahead, Mary. Yeah.
So Professor Lim, I want to ask, so if we label the intensity of a certain event as being similar to the intensity of another devastation, another event, does it always lead to us becoming reductionists? Or do you think that there is also a possibility for certain positives to follow such juxtapositions, especially for events that still remain unknown to many people, as opposed to events that gain more coverage?
May I respond? Abhishek? Yes,
Yeah,
thank you
please.
very much. Yeah, for your question. I mean, I think there's also the ambivalence. There exists ambivalence in the self-perception of one's own tragedy through intensity and scales and so on. Yes, on the one hand, as we have discussed, it may lead people to a sort of a certain self-justification or justifying their certain nationalist memory emotionally. But on the other hand, I think that in the first stage of recognizing or I mean, the self-affirming their own pains and sufferings, tragedies, I think it also may lead those victims to a sort of self-empowerment. So there's always certain the divergent tendencies between self-empowerment and also instrumentalization. Political instrumentalization can be found simultaneously from one individual agent or individual actor or individual victim. So these, I mean, this really, they are intermingled. But one cannot really divide which party is for the self-empowerment, which party is for the political instrumentalization. So we need to be very sensitive. We need to on alert, right? The same thing can have a different impact from context to context. So I think that as a historian, I would say, being alert to context, a very specific context in which this specific feeling is located, memory is located, is very important. So, but also I have, while I was listening and your project, suddenly I remembered your book, Walter Scott Comes to Netherlands. I mean, I think that Walter Scott is quite popular even in East Asia. When I was a kid, we were reading Walter Scott, a Korean translation of Walter Scott. I don't know if that translation was really right or not, but it doesn't matter. Actually, Walter Scott also worked very effectively in promoting nationalist sentiments among the young kids in Korea in 1960s and 70s. So I was just thinking, what about your earlier work on the Walter Scott's, the history of reading Walter Scott transnationally in Europe may be extended to perhaps India and South Africa and East Asia. That will be also a very interesting project if you have enough time and resources.
Great. So someone wants to know, Diana Ferrero, was a link to Dr. Regner's database shared earlier in the presentation. So it'd be possible to share it later to the participants, if that's okay.
Thanks very much for Diana for this question. Our database will be made public in the future, but we're not at the point yet where we have a public interface. But if anybody in the audience is interested in hearing more, please contact me, and I'd be happy to give you access. So you'll see it's the sort of get a sense of what's happening in the kitchen before we get to present it publicly, hopefully in a year or so.
Terrific. I'm sure I'll receive lots of emails after that. Definitely for me. So there's a question from Merin, I think. Hi, Merin. Do you want to go ahead and ask a question? Got a hand raised. Yeah.
Everyone, it was absolutely fascinating to listen to the presentations. So I just have a very quick comment and an observation. Yeah, more like sharing some of our work as well. So we work here at the Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras. So as part of our ongoing research, we have been trying to digitally archive and produce immersive experiences which would recreate memory as well as history. So in that context, I was just wondering what would be the implications for historicizing. What would be the implications, particularly for identity creation in the context of an increasing digitization, which is also quite difficult to resist in this current scenario. So we have been discussing quite a lot about memory and the archives and how that has been almost creating a paradigm shift in the way we look at subjects, in the way subjects are being recorded, in the way subjects are being archived, in the way subjects are being accessed. And also there's a free-flowing fluidity in the current scenario where it's very difficult to distinguish between the historian and the subjects which are getting historicized, because there are also a lot of interactive archives where anyone can sort of get in and edit, provide information, edit information. Yeah, in fact, we could perhaps say that this started, Wikipedia kind of started off this revolution many years ago, and now it has become a very normalized, standardized sort of processing of history as well. So I was just wondering if any of the panelists would like to respond or leave a comment on that in terms of, because this is also the future of historicizing. This is also the future of how different memory narratives are going to be recorded. Yeah.
So does anyone go and respond to that? Please go ahead.
Well, if I might kick it off, obviously, Merin, this incredibly important topic, right? For all of those involved in cultural memory studies and attentive to different forms of representation and the affordances of different media, the fact that we are now or have moved already into a different media ecology means that we have to rethink many of our assumptions about memory and how it's produced. So I think we just have to get hold of that and try to think our way through it. However, I in that regard remain a historian, and I do think it's very important that we continue to have a long-term view of these processes. Ji-yoon kindly referred to my book on Walter Scott, which is all about the 19th century. I've by now moved into the 21st century, some of you will be happy to know, but it's still with that sense of things which have a long-term resonance, right? So something that's written in the 1950s, like Aimé Césaire, translating the poet in the 1950s, that still continues to have a slow release at later periods. So I think while we move forward, thinking about the impact of the digital on community formations, on narratives, on the cycle of turnovers, with a big question mark about the future of the very possibility of long-term memory. I think we have to grasp that. At the same time, I think we would be foolish if we ignore the possibility of what we might already learn from long-term procedures. So I think let's try and do the two, because otherwise I think we will miss out on what history can also teach us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Rickney. We'll certainly look forward to having a longer conversation with you from the Center for Memory Studies.
Thank you.
Look forward to that.
Duan, Zahir, you want to respond to the question?
So thanks for the question, Merin. I think I'm thinking as a scholar of heritage and museum studies, I'm I'm excited about the possibilities of employing media that allows for immersive experiences around memory in museum and museum-like settings. I think it's really wonderful, especially to hear from from people and places where culturally and socially significant events actually occurred. Of course, there's no substitute for actual witnesses, eyewitnesses. I'm thinking about sites like Robben Island and Districts Museum, where you get guided through a space, but and you get a narration from someone who actually experienced that particular event. However, when these narratives are created in heritage and museum settings, I think what's most important to think about, or at least what I think about, is what subject positions are you affording your visitors when you present them with a set of narratives, mediated narratives. Or what subject positions are they allowed to take in relation to the story that is provided to them? How are they enabled to participate in thinking with you about the event that you want to commemorate? And I mean, it's in some instances, it's really important to narrow the subject positions in ways that allow the fullness of a historical event, or the moral significance of a historical event, to come through. So, for example, at the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, you want to enable a narrative that reinforces the injustice of having been forcefully removed from your place of residence on the basis of apartheid era laws around segregation. And you want that to come through because that is a minority narrative that isn't recognized in a dominant historical narrative. So you want that to come through, but sometimes it becomes a little bit more tricky, and in other contexts it could become a little bit more tricky. And so there should be a flexibility in being able to afford some sense of agency in being able to take different subject positions. I think the use of digital resources in these kinds of immersive settings is also really important, but we should also think about as Anne mentions, like these affordances provided by digital media and databases, for example. But not just leave it at that to say, well, we'll generate a database of memories, for example, and that is the main output, and we've done this now. That's the archival work. It doesn't, that kind of approach doesn't necessarily enable us to continuously critically interrogate the tools that we are using, not only for generating archives, but also for the way in which we're representing our memories. So if we just take our digital resources for granted in initiating these kinds of projects, then I think there's too much of a ceding of authority to the tools and materials that we're actually using, versus a continuous open-ended critical engagement with the analysis and intellectual enterprise of thinking about what memory actually is. I hope I got my point.
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much for this, because this really resonates with one of our current projects, which is presenting the immersive life of a transnational community, an Anglo-Indian community, through a digital exhibition, a physical as well as digital exhibition, where the photographs, the memoirs, other documents, letters, objects could be viewed through the augmented reality tool. And what is very fascinating here is really resonates with what Professor Jethro was sharing, because here the curators are the members of the community. It's not historians, the ones who are providing the material, the ones who are vetting the material, the ones who are validating the material. They're all the curators, and we are working very closely with them. Yeah. So this has been really wonderful to have to have listened to this panel. Thank you very much.
Zayun, you have a response to that comment?
Just one thing I want to remind myself of: the agency of visitors. Regardless of the intention, whatever intention is, actually what kind of intention was made by the organizers or exhibition, agencies. But every visitor has one's own agency, so their own interpretation, very often betrays the intention of the organizers of exhibitions. My experience, a few years ago, I organized an exhibition of the Roma and Sinti victims of Holocaust in Seoul. My main intention was to say that to show the Koreans, that my contemporary Koreans, we Koreans also under the certain conditions, we Koreans can be also accomplices like those Germans who were neighbors of those Roma Sintis in 1930s Germany. But most of Korean visitors, interpreted that exhibition. Oh, those Romas and Sintis were victims like as Koreans under Japanese colonial rule. So even we educated docents. So our intention is not to repeat we Koreans were victims under Japanese colonial rule. We would say that under certain given circumstances, we Koreans can be perpetrators or accomplices. We are not just victims, but their perception of that exhibition totally betrayed our intentions. So I was really a little bit, at first, I was really embarrassed, but later I found that, okay, that happens to almost every exhibition. So how do we accommodate this agency of visitors whose way of framing those memories that or the seeing those exhibitions is quite different. How can we really accommodate with them, reconcile with them, compromise with them? It still remains a challenge, I think, for all the organizers of the exhibitions.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Lim. That's a very powerful word, intention, because that is something I guess we all need to bear in mind, particularly when one is archiving the present, archiving the contemporary, and archiving the lived experiences. Yeah. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, I suppose it connects to the good old situatedness of the storyteller that we talk about in literary studies, where the storyteller is situated, right? The phenomenological, experiential situatedness, which we can never do away with, no matter how sophisticated we become digitally. So I guess that balance is pretty interesting, as Duran was also mentioning. So I think we're almost, there's almost time. We're closing 2 hours. I managed to mess up the sequence at the beginning, for which I apologize. I think there was supposed to be an introduction to the panel, and I sort of jumped right into it. My apologies. But Aline, do you want to come in now and with some closing remarks for the panel? But I would just leave it here by saying it's been an absolute privilege moderating this panel. I take away a lot personally from this as an academic, as a student of memory studies, and I'll be sure to get in touch with each one of you, and I hope it's been an enjoyable session for all of you who attended it. So thank you very much again, and I hand it back to Aline.
Yeah, thank you very much. I basically only wanted to echo your words, Abhishek. This was a great panel. Thanks to all 3 panelists. Thanks to you for moderating this, and thanks to the audience, especially for asking great questions and participating also in the chat. This is our last event of the week of events. We unfortunately had to cancel the one tomorrow because 2 out of the 3 panelists had to cancel last minute, so we cannot go ahead with our event tomorrow. But we had 4 great events this week, and I'd like to remind you that next week we have the working groups, national and regional groups, that have organized a very rich program on Monday and on Tuesday. So please stay tuned, look at the website. All the panels are listed there with the different speakers and the topics, and all the Zoom links are there as well. So you can just zoom in and have a look. And also, get to know a little bit the other groups within the MSA. I'd like to also thank all the organizers that were working behind the scenes. They have not been very visible, of course, because we had to organize this instead of our annual conference that was supposed to take place in Seoul. I think we're still a bit sad that we couldn't actually travel to Seoul and see each other in person. But yeah, this was the best we could do, and thanks so much for making this possible. Those of you who are not members of the MSA yet, because this was open to everybody, also people who are maybe not familiar with the association yet, maybe you got intrigued and maybe you want to know a little bit more. We are welcoming new members anytime. So please, again, just check our website and see if you want to sign up. And then I really hope that we will see each other finally in person again next year at our annual conference in Newcastle, and that we will have a great gathering in person where we can really exchange new ideas, etc. So yeah, thanks a lot to everybody, and hope to see you all soon.
Take care and stay safe, everyone. Bye.